Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, or Masonic authority. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. Just a quick reminder that you can now listen early and ad-free to our podcast with our new subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial in the notes for this episode. And just looking at him on my screen, I realize it's probably been a while since we've had our guest back. Brother Franklin Rings joins us for a podcast episode on the Stoic approach to our craft. Welcome back, Brother Rings.
Thank you for having me, Brother Arce. It's a great honor and a great privilege.
It was, I think, the fall of last year when we had a great conversation with Brother Franklin on Taoism. I still remember how to say it right. I was saying Taoism at first, but he helped me out there. And incidentally, it became one of our top 5 most listened to episodes for 2022. So congratulations again, Brother Rings.
Congratulations on your podcast success in that regard.
It's all because of the guests. And since then, I've been able to kind of pick up some of my Stoic books and get back to some of my Stoicism to prepare for our time together. And I'm just interested, knowing you're a deep guy. You're really kind of impressed with like the Far East or Eastern mysticism and mindset. How did you land on Stoicism? How did you discover it?
So Stoicism has a pretty deep aspect of my life in that regard. I discovered it right at the beginning of the pandemic. I was going through some pretty tumultuous and personal things in my life. And I just began using Spotify during this time period. And during that time period, I found a podcast called the Stoic Coffee Break. And the Stoic Coffee Break essentially takes Stoic principles and a quote and breaks it down to a good lecture that you can do within like the span of a coffee break. And that got my mind thinking more positively and giving me more energy. And that really pushed me to begin seeking out the philosophy in a more like fuller breath in a deeper way. But it really started with a podcast.
So you were already a master Mason at that. Oh, actually, no, you were getting ready to get into Masonry at that point.
I was actually inquiring into Freemasonry at that time period, but I wasn't even like an interested gentleman at that point.
Okay.
So
there was no potential crossover, nothing you were reading in one side where you're like, oh, I'm influenced. I want to learn a little bit more about that over here.
I think Stoicism did begin to move me into the lens of wanting to work with a group of men who shared virtue. But during that time period, I don't think I was really looking into Freemasonry outside of maybe seeing what the group was about, because the two, of course, do overlap in some capacity.
Right. And that's the interesting thing. When you think about outsiders or those looking to get into the craft, there's so many other parts of what happens in Freemasonry that does touch into other disciplines or practices or ways of thought. But you're so focused on that little bucket of what that thimble of, either it's the conspiracy theories or the National Treasure movies, that pop culture that things like Stoicism sometimes like just slide under the radar there.
Indeed. Yeah, it's super true. Stoicism is something that continues to like pop out throughout time too. Like it'll go by the wayside for a couple hundred years, but then you'll see a few key individuals bring it back out into the light, and it'll have like this explosion of like almost like a cultural renewal, and then it will fall back down. So I think it kind of it does align in that regard.
Yeah, for me, I discovered Stoicism after I had taken, I think I was a fellow craft, if not a master Mason at that point. No, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I was a master Mason at that point because I was working for a health club chain in Albany. And one of the personal trainers that I became friends with, we just fell onto Marcus Aurelius's meditations. And I had discovered it through a friend. And it was one of those books that allegedly Bill Clinton reads every summer, and a lot of like world leaders will quote, this is where they get, their inspiration or ideas on how to become a stronger leader. So I picked it up and started thumbing through it. And this guy was also reading it. And we just had this weird conversation. No longer were we talking about sets and supersets and resting and active rest days. We started having these cool conversations on Stoicism. So I had wished that I had been more exposed to it, because things that we talk about in our degree, and we'll get to that in this podcast episode, it was like taking a highlighter in my mind and going, oh, that's what they were talking about, because it also relates to this in Stoicism.
Yes, super true. I mean, there are so many overlapping points, and I find that once somebody gets introduced to Stoicism in particular, it's been my experience that they begin seeing how it applies in their own lives, and then they start to really run with it in that direction. So I can see that for sure.
So let's level set here, because I'm sure for our listener that may not be familiar with Stoicism, they're like, okay, is this going to be one of those episodes where they talk about it, but they never really tell me what it means? And there's a couple places, and we're going to share the links. We'll share the Stoic Coffee Break podcast that Brother Rings suggested. I'm also going to share this one. I think he's probably one of the better known modern Stoics, and that's Ryan Holiday, who has the Daily Stoic book and also a podcast with the same name. There's a newsletter, his email newsletter you can sign up for. If I was to explain Stoicism to an outsider or someone unfamiliar with it, I would just say it's a way of thinking about your problems or struggles that happen in life with the mindset that, hey, think of it as a game that's all been played before. It's all been decided. So the things that you would want to, that could potentially cause stress or problems in your life, don't focus on those. Focus more on the things that you can control and the decisions that you can make that could possibly provide a better outcome for, again, what's already been decided, what's already been done. I think the biggest Stoic idea that I always give people is, to me, life is a series of tiny little events that maybe in the moment seemed like massive things. Put it into the thought of like getting a new job or a promotion at work, or working as a Freemason, going, to becoming a master mason. That was the thing you wanted to do, but there were tons of little steps that had to happen in order for the big thing to happen. And you never really know what the big thing is because it hasn't happened yet, but you think all of these tiny little moments are those things. And as a Stoic, you would take a step back and just realize, okay, these are many parts that are going to equal a greater sum. That's my interpretation. How do you explain it, Franklin?
I think that's an incredibly concise way to put it, honestly. There's a lot of different ways to interpret Stoicism, but I truly think it's best defined as a way to live a virtuous life. And the Stoic principles are guided by 4 foundational virtues, which are courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom, which kind of overlap with Masonry very heavily. But following those 4 cardinal virtues will allow you to live a virtuous life by those 4 virtues. And if you can take those 4 virtues, run with them, and notice things that you can control and what you cannot control, and begin to exercise those virtues and the things you can control, and just be more mindful surrounding the things you do not control, it's almost like you're walking through life, and life is like a dark cave. And if you don't have the virtues, you can't see where you're going. But if you have the virtues, it's like a torch that allows you to see your surroundings and gain a better idea of what's going on. And then you actually know the path in which you need to walk. And those virtues help you do that.
One of the other lessons for me was it takes me back to my midnight Freemason days. I had to Google search for this article, but I lifted a part of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations when he talks about, it's like he's screaming up to the heavens, I can imagine. He says, quote, "Is it possible that one day I shall see you, O my soul, good, simple, indivisible, stripped of every pretense, more solid than the flesh that covers you now? Will you ever know a day of unclouded love and tenderness? Will you ever be content, no hopes, no regrets, needing nothing, desiring nothing, animate or inanimate, not even for a moment's pleasure, nor wanting a little more to prolong the ecstasy or more pleasing room or view or climate or sweet accord in your relationships with others?" Like, he's basically saying, will there ever come a time in my life, this person inside of me that's pulling all these levers, will you ever just be satisfied? Or are you always going to be wanting to attain and achieve more? And when I read that, I was like, whoa, that's the 24-inch gauge. That's what the whole part about divesting our heart and consciousness of the superfluities of life. That's the working tools that we get in the EA, like right there. He is struggling with this in his life. Like, which one of us haven't sat here? And to me, this is an example that I give to a lot of, I mean, I don't really always quote Marcus Aurelius to the brothers I do Masonic education with, but when we look for an example and it's like, well, what does it mean, vices and superfluities? I think of the words of Marcus Aurelius, which is the constant need that drives a lot of us. Those desires, they're not in due bounds of what's good with mankind or even with ourselves. Like, we have to identify that and sometimes just take a pause and say, let me just enjoy this moment and enjoy the happiness I have right now.
When I think about things precisely like that, I always think about the square and compasses. Like, temperance is one of the cardinal virtues of Stoicism. And I think that relates almost directly to the square. Like, you have to square your actions. You have to keep yourself in due balance with the compasses, right? These two things should hopefully point you in the direction of things you can control and things you can influence your will on. And that all ends up leading back to you. You can see that with the compasses. So I couldn't agree more.
I think of, when it comes to morality and virtue, and think of that beautiful part in the third degree when the senior deacon has a conversation with the candidate before the Hiramic legend begins, where you really get into talking about the legacy of Hiram Abiff and why he's held in such a high regard. And you literally in 2 sentences, like, say, this is why he was known for this, and he exemplified it by doing this. And to me, when I got to that part of learning that, this was now 3 years after discovering Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. And I'm like, this is what they're talking about when it comes to a virtuous life and being a morally centered, good person.
Yeah, the virtue is just absolutely integral. And I think Hiram Abiff is an archetypal figure for exactly that. He's exemplifying who and what we should be acting like what is that modality in your life you're trying to emulate and work on. And in that regard, I think he's near synonymous with these Stoic principles. I mean, you can see it in the courage, which is the first of the cardinal virtues in Stoicism. Hiram Abiff is courageous in the actions he takes, and that's literally the foundation of how Stoics should be living their lives.
You've dropped a couple phrases. You mentioned memento mori, which does have a crossover with Freemasonry. I'll try to combine a couple other principles here. One is, I might be saying this wrong, but it's amor fati, which is love of fate, the Stoics' acceptance of love and of the fate of destiny. The other idea, as we've kind of mentioned throughout this, is the self-discipline, mastering one's emotions and desires. You made a comment that this kind of connects to that square and compass. And I feel like the explanation of the square and compass throughout our degrees, I always feel bad for the square because it's just said, it's a square. Just square your actions. And it's just such a simple thing. But when you examine it through now this wider lens with a little Stoicism sprinkled on top, how much wider does your perspective of the square and compasses go for you?
Just about as far as the compasses can extend,
Nice.
Which is 180 degrees. So the way I think about them is always through the lens of the 4 cardinal virtues of Stoicism, which for people to do some research on, especially Masonic brethren, they near overlap with the Masonic cardinal virtues. So they play hand in hand. I really think about the square and temperance like a ton. I think temperance is a huge one. Personally, I'm working on it in my life, so that's why it immediately comes to mind. But temperance is an incredibly important thing for our society, and the square helps with that. The square keeps things squared away, so that way we have a square line on where we know the divide is, or where the divide should be in our mind of this is too much and this is not enough. And the square helps me align with temperance in that regard. When I think about the compasses, I do kind of think about that one with temperance a lot as well. But of course, it has its play in all things, right? Like it definitely works with justice as well. You think about you're the center of the compass sometimes, and you know what is within your sphere to help control and influence. And we want to be righteous in that regard, and we want to be able to help people. And justice is a huge benefactor in that regard. And justice is the principle you rely on in that regard. So there really is so much fluidity in these ideas.
Yeah. And death is such a big part. I know this sounds really weird to say, but it's such a big part of Stoicism.
It is.
It gets uncomfortable to talk about it because nobody wants it. It's again that date that's already been predetermined for us, and how it's going to happen already been set.
Certainly.
And in Freemasonry, we also talk about that almost in the same way, which I feel is one of those, like, when I say it's uncomfortable, it's like when you're trying to have a conversation with somebody about Freemasonry or Stoicism, and you're like, oh, and then I don't want to say this, but it comes out sounding this way, like, we really don't fear death. What are you guys, like, crazy? Like, no, we just we understand that it's not the end. We specifically in Freemasonry, we believe in the immortality of the soul, that it continues to go on.
Yes.
In Stoicism, it's kind of a different way of how it's approached. I remember Marcus Aurelius talking about it, and to me, this was beautiful. Like, a chef's kiss, where he compares life to the leaves falling from trees and returning to the earth.
Oh man, I'm glad you touched on memento mori, which for the listeners, if they don't happen to be proficient in Latin, which I certainly am not, is meditation on death, mortality, memento mori, and amor fati being the love of fate, right? Like this imagery is so powerful. The quote I came up with the sword hanging over your head, that comes from the daily Stoic and meditations as well. Like this imagery has been absolutely integral for a lot of things I do outside of Freemasonry as well. So I think a lot of people get this whole like perception of death thing wrong in that regard. Like if you imagine instead that, like, a lot of people think when they live their life, they're born, and then as soon as they're born, death is free from them. Like they don't have death. And then when they die, death shows up and life is not there, right? But I think through the Stoic lens, this is the wrong way to think about it. You should truly think about it as you're born, and then without anxiety, but actually like some calm comfort, you actually walk with death throughout your whole life. The sword hangs over your head, and you don't know when it's going to drop. And hence this memento mori, you sit down and you recognize, like, wow, I could leave this life at any moment, which is another Stoic phrase, be prepared to leave this life at any moment. And if that sword is consistently hanging over your head, I think a lot of people, especially in today's society, might feel like anxious or scared about that, and they might become frenzied in their actions. But the Stoic perspective and lens is that if that sword hangs over you, you should be consistently reminded to live a virtuous and good life and actually die well in that regard. Like you don't want to die and then think, wow, like if you could look back on your day, like, wow, I really blew and wasted a lot of my day. I didn't like spend time on the things I need to do, or the things I know I need to do through your meditation of death, right? So if you think about memento mori and you think about that sword hanging over your head and you realize, wow, I am actually free from the coil of death because now I'm empowered to live a virtuous life, because who knows what the next breath could bring me in that regard. So that's my perspective on it at the very least.
And then the beautiful imagery of it, like having lived in upstate New York, and one of the most beautiful times of the year is our fall, our autumn, when you see all the foliage and the trees and the changing of the colors, and you're like, what's happening scientifically, which can be explained, this tree is slowly dying and there's beauty in death, and then it falls to the ground only for those leaves to become fertilizer so that the tree can continue to live during the harshness of winter and provide new seeds and new opportunities for growth again in the spring. And when you weave that concept into like death, and it touches each of us at different parts in our lives and has completely different meaning. Like now, as a man in his I'm 45, I look to my dad, who is, it's common, he's at that age where he's losing a lot of friends to old age or chronic disease or whatever. It happens. Like the candle burns out, so to speak. But I've also had, close friends or people that you see on the news that just pass away at such a young age, and like, wow, it's just so sad. And I think as a Freemason, why I say I don't fear death, it's not like I'm welcoming it in any aspect, but I understand that I've built my symbolic temple. I have my working tools. I have a purpose and a task on a daily basis that I try to deliver to improve the lives of other people that are in my circle and my sphere, and try to leave this world a better place than how I found it. All those wonderful imagery things. And as you had said, and I won't add anything to how you outlined it with the Stoics, but that's where there's again the parallel between our great fraternity of this ancient and gentle craft and the words that were coming from these men centuries ago, and how they still are relevant and relate to what's happening today. Is that, again, like, you may think that your life, you're living in a unique time and you have unique challenges and stresses. Dude, life is like a Google search. I could Google it and we could find other examples of people who, in this world, the numbers, the math, it's too big to just think that you're just this sole little individual thing. And that's basically a combination of what Stoicism is telling you, is that it's the experiences, life is your experiences of the moments you share with others that you can continue to share with those that are going to come after you.
Yeah, sincerely. Like, Ryan Holiday mentions this thing that always gives me so much positive energy when I look out at my day, which is like, again, this recognition that life is cyclical. Like, even though death hangs over us, like, you live and you die. This is just natural, right? And the Stoics really, again, they have their base actually in cynicism. So the Crates of Thebes, right? I believe that's cynicism. So he was a very famous cynic of the time. The founder of Stoicism learned cynicism from Crates of Thebes and actually then made that into Stoicism, and it's transferred all the way down the lineage to us, right? And Zeno learned from Crates of Thebes that you need to live in accordance with nature, and death is just a natural part of the world we live in that regard. And the thing that I was attempting to allude to with Ryan is that he mentions that those who pick up the torch of this way of living are just one in a line and series of people and this tradition and lineage of people who are trying to live their life in this virtuous manner. So you're part of that cycle in that regard, of people who are trying to live in accordance with nature and are picking up the torch in this heritage, maybe not through blood, but through the way of thinking and the way of being, as the Stoics have done for literally thousands of years. So
again, the parallel here would be Masonry. The way I describe it to people is it's like a code of how we decide to live our lives. And we're not saying that living to be a good and virtuous person, only Masons have the answers to that. No, there's other people, the other religions and cultures and traditions that also have seen that there is a path to get here. And we understand that, like, it's not something that everybody can do. So it's not our job to try to reach and bring people up. It's just our job to do what we believe we should be doing, and allowing for that literal light to be open for others to be exposed to discover and then decide on their own if they're going to live through this. So as you're saying as well, like, Freemasonry is all about the actions that we display are what influence other people. So now if we take it to a real simple setting, would be when you're sitting in your next, a business meeting at work, or just even if for brothers, you're sitting in a meeting at lodge, or you're sitting around the table with your family at dinner, and somebody proposes an idea or asks a question that's outlandish, stupid, silly, makes no sense, it's irrelevant, and it's there's no purpose to it. Instead of jumping down that person's throat, making a joke that would be at their expense, taking that step back is the Stoic approach, and also should be the Masonic approach of, okay, I understand my words have meaning, actions have meaning. what can I say or what can I do? Or should I just do nothing and let it pass? And sometimes that's the answer as well. So I feel like you and we could talk for days and hours, and I love that, but we're coming close to our time here on this episode of the podcast. And I really hope that during our discussion, Franklin and I have brought light to the practice of Stoicism. Again, we're going to share some links in the notes for this episode on resources that you can use, from podcasts to reading materials or even email newsletters you can sign up for. I just want to leave one little takeaway here about the Stoic approach. And it doesn't really advocate for suppressing our feelings or emotions, but rather it emphasizes understanding and managing them in a rational and constructive manner. So with that side note, when you hear the term Stoic versus when you heard it early on in your life, what does it mean to you now, Stoicism?
I'm so glad you asked that question. This is probably the most important conversation that can be had surrounding the philosophy. And I'm going to make myself a bit of a fool here, but I don't remember where I heard this from, whether this was from Ryan Holiday or whether this was from, I think actually, now that I remember, I believe it was from the Stoic Coffee Break, but they talk about the difference between lowercase s Stoicism and uppercase s Stoicism. And what I believe most of our civilization think of as being Stoic, and Stoicism is lowercase s. So for, English, of course, the lowercase s is smaller, right? So lowercase s, that is the cultural imagery we have in our mind of the person who can sit there and suppress their emotions and be completely unchanged by outside influences. There are people who have natural dispositions to that, but that is not Stoicism. Stoicism, the philosophy, is capital S. And as I've begun to understand it now, it's what we've talked about, right? It's about noticing your emotions and how they make you feel, and you're more than allowed and accepted to feel these things and begin to understand why, but you just don't allow them to control you or make your actions for you. You simply just meditate on them, hopefully be mindful and recognize why you feel the way you feel, and then you make conscious, logical, and rational action based on that, as opposed to the lowercase s, which would be almost sometimes unhealthy, which is just like not allowing yourself to feel those emotions and kind of play off in your mind that there is maybe nothing bad going on and you're being irrational in that regard. So I would highly, highly recommend, of course, if you're going to take the Stoic approach, like feeling your emotions, and don't feel like you can't feel them. Just don't allow them to make your actions for you.
This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. Again, big thanks. I feel, it's so funny. I know you, and I can see you on the screen. I wish we could share that with the listeners, but for such a young guy, he is so wise. Our guest, Brother Franklin Rings, thanks again for coming on, brother. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, Brother RC. A reminder that you can listen to future episodes of the Craftsman Online Podcast early and ad-free with our subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial in the notes for this episode. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.